Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the BCS and to the Computer Art Society Christmas lecture. We may as well bill it as such since we're close enough to the event. So I'm very pleased to welcome our co-chair, Sean Clark, Dr. Sean Clark, indeed. And he's obviously well known to us all, but for some people online who may not know his extensive list of achievements, I would say that Sean's career with New Media Art goes back to the 1990s, goes back to your work with Shamans and Rave and that sort of sorts of things there. And yes, you'll touch on as we work with Payman, and subsequently you became sort of interested in the work of systems artists, and indeed sort of trace, I think, some connections from the work that has been done in the British systems artists to the interactive pieces that you've done more recently, with your strong connections, of course, to Leicester de Montfort, and also to the sort of art scene there as well, the Phoenix and the many other things that happened there. Sean has been very key to the Computer Art Society, not least for the developing of the Computer Arts Archive, and also really the extensive work that you've done with other media artists and digital artists to catalogue and really sort of draw together also those strands. So I think considering the work that Kaz has done in the past, so further ado, I'll introduce you work with, you said reconstructivism.
That is the term I'm using.
Yeah. Well, tell us more.
Very well, thanks for coming along. As promised, there will be wine after this. Just keep the interest going. I can see there are people coming in online, or I can let in. So this is actually the first time since I've been chair, which is now 3 years, that I've actually done a talk about my own work. Normally I'm facilitating conversations about other people's work. But I thought it was probably about time, particularly given that I had a new collection. Maybe I explained it, and there might be some interesting things to talk about that might be relevant to the development of CAS in the future. So I'm going to present a piece of work called Computational Constructs, which is some new work that I've been developing for a little while. You'll see how long. But I'm fairly happy with it. Like all my work, it's never complete. I realise this. I just have points at which I show my progress, and then I move on to the next one. What I'm trying to do is have a bit more closure and say this is a body of work. The next thing will always be in progress. So computational constructs, and I'm going to introduce a term that I call reconstructivism as its working title, about the work and its key features and how it might on the basis of perhaps thinking about digital art in a fresh way. Apparently some of these slides take a bit of time to load, so oh no, that's all right. So a little bit of background. I think, like Nick said, I've been involved in being creative with computers for quite a long time. I probably didn't call myself an artist until the early 2000s, but the work I did in the 90s and early 2000s was quite creative. I was a researcher at Loughborough University, where my project supervisor was Professor Stephen Scrivener, and my head of department was Professor Ernest Edmonds, who's here today. I was heavily involved in the early internet. So when I say early internet, I mean the 1960s internet, the 90s internet, really I mean the web. And I was using the internet before the web, and when the web came along, I had a good combination of skills to make effective use of it. I was also interested in virtual reality, which is not new. I'm sure most people realise that. And I will show you a couple of pictures in a minute of what virtual reality looked like back in the day. And also multimedia, so CD-ROMs at the time, and VGA performance, which I did a lot of. I left my research career in '95 to help start up a very early web design company. I was involved in a lot of clubs and festivals and ads, that is. I did lots of activities around the rave scene and so on. And then I formed my own company in 2000, where I brought together my commercial skills with my creative skills, and that became the basis of how I earned my income for the next 20 years or so. And in 2000, I had my first gallery exhibition. So a couple of pictures of sort of things I was involved in. So that's not here. This is a chap called Colin Angus from the band called The Shaman. I worked a lot with them. He was very interested in internet, multimedia, virtual reality, cyberculture, as it was broadly called at the time. This, one of their album covers, that was designed by William Latham. So I got to know William back in the day there. I created an interactive version of this album, which was the first time it was done, which went online in '96, '97. It was quite well received. And some of the other things I did with the band, we did online single releases, we did events, we did streaming, webcasts. I used the term webcast before everyone else was using it, but I don't claim I invented it. The best at the time, the best we could do was stream images, not video, from gigs. Quite good fun. And that is me at the end of a video link in the early 90s. The sharpest video, that's what it looked like. All in there. I don't think it's the same session, but it might have been. I might have been talking to him. Me at Glastonbury with my son, who's now big and in his 30s. That was with the Shaman. I also attended lots of gigs with the Zion Train and other bands and so on. This was Homebrew Virtual Reality. It's a chap called Chris Hand down there. You don't see my cursor with that one. That's a Nintendo Power Glove. It's a games accessory that you could use to control a virtual world that looked like this. The interesting thing about it is I see a lot of stuff now, people stylize it to look like that. It's almost become sort of fashionable to look retro. But then I did my first exhibition, this final picture in that bottom row, so I don't think you see my cursor, at the Quad Gallery in Derby in 2000. This was a collaboration with a good friend of mine, Jeff Broadway, and it was projections into a pool of water with sort of spatial sound, which is a sort of format I guess I have for a while. I use that format, projections and sound and lots of flow and this, that and the other. So my career started in the 90s in using computers to be creative, but I didn't really start to think of myself as an artist until a bit later on. So I'd do live shows and we did big projections and sometimes really big gigs, we go touring and things like that. But I started to think about systems thinking and how systems ideas can be used in art. Now, this wasn't something that I suddenly started thinking in the 2000s. As an undergraduate and in the early 90s, I discovered the work of Fritjof Capra, who wrote popular science books, if you like, about systems thinking, like the web of life and the systems view of life and the Tao of physics, quite a famous one. And I really became quite attracted to this idea of thinking about the world and the interactions around us and interpersonal interactions as being a system focus rather than maybe a more reductionist, classic sort of scientific view. The idea that systems are connected, collections of connected and interacting things that form a whole, and the whole may have properties that don't exist within the elements, was very attractive. It's clearly something that can be applied to the idea of ecosystems and living systems, but really all complexity in the universe emerges through system-like behavior. Considering them, thinking of them as systems, which we'll go into in a bit more detail, was interesting. So I was interested in systems and I was being creative with computers, and it started to overlap, and I started to think about the idea that maybe you could combine systems thinking with art. Now, at the time, my digital art history was very poor. I didn't realize that people had been thinking about this for many, many years, but it meant independently I was able to think about some of these things. And when I finally caught up with the literature, I had a sort of background that I wanted to bring into it. So I would say that my early creative work started to develop what was a systems aesthetic, and I'll show some pictures in a minute. Systems contain parts that form wholes, and a holistic way of looking at systems looks at the wholes, not just the parts. A reductionist view, the classic sort of scientific view, is often very focused around the parts and doesn't necessarily look at the wholes. Less so now, actually. I think systems thinking has become more well used and established. I was interested in flow, so a lot of my imagery was flowing shapes that, if you like, morphed from one into the other. That occasionally you sort of became almost became disorientating because you didn't quite know what's going on, then it would come into focus and so on. Temporality, so the idea that things change over time. And then different perspectives, how you can look at the world, the same phenomena in two different ways, and your background, your system approach can allow you to interpret it very differently. And so what I started to do really was to think, well, how can I move from being a VJ and performance and club-based artist to maybe an artist who might show work in a gallery? And that really coincided with me thinking about how can I change my work so it's not just about systems, but behaves like systems. And at the time I thought I had a great idea. I could make an artwork that is a system, and the system would be the art. not the thing that you saw on the screen. You'd be a bit more conceptual. The system is the thing that matters. And of course, it had been done, but it was still interesting for a year or two to think that I'd invented something. However, what I decided to do in around 2006 was to start formalizing my work a little bit. I'd come from a research background. I'd gone off and worked in lots of different fields, or mostly web design and multimedia. And then I came back thinking I wanted to re-engage with research. And so I started an MA at Camberwell in 2006 and 8. And I'm not the only one who did that master's, not at the same time, but I think, were you before or after me?
Year after you shot.
Year after, yeah. Great masters, really good masters. And you could do it part-time. So because I was working, I was able to do the masters whilst also running my company. It was called Cuttlefish. See, Cuttlefish in a minute. So thinking about that sort of early context, I didn't have a camera phone at the time. They didn't exist. And so it's not as well documented as I would like. But there are some interesting images here. This first one sort of is a hand, but it's I really like this idea of mixing images that were based upon this idea that you can look at something, look at the parts, and somehow gain insight to it. And so, atomic anatomy drawings, other line drawings, and so on, ways of describing a thing according to its parts. I would often combine those images with more holistic images of people in this case and other things. So I had quite a strong aesthetic. I think it worked quite well, and I'd use this in my live shows, but also when I started doing gallery shows. And there's a very fuzzy. Also at the time, I thought, oh, I haven't got very good quality pictures. And actually, this was the quality of the pictures when you took a digital picture back then. I think this middle one is a Glastonbury, maybe 97, 98. It was a big crowd anyway, about 5,000 people doing live work there. Some of the other images. So that image might mix nicely with an anatomy drawing of a hand, human being. That's a cuttlefish. I got really into cuttlefish. These are morphing, ever-changing creatures. I think this was a show in Helsinki. That actually for this, and the internet was starting, the web was becoming more established, and everyone hated banner ads. So I created a performance that was nothing but banner ads. I just went, every time I saw a banner ad, I took a screen grab and I turned it into a live mix. And this was a show, I think in 2000, the band Zion Train, at a festival in Zambia called Solip, Solar Eclipse Festival. On the day of the summer solstice, 21st of June, there was a full solar eclipse. And this is the band standing actually on a termite hill. So that's the sort of thing I managed to get flag. Being the multimedia person, I got to go to the big shows. So that's a fantastic show. It's what it looks like in the middle of an eclipse, actually. If you haven't seen one with a nice clear sky, there's a sunset all around you. You see this sort of sunset everywhere, dusk. It's quite fun. So I'd come from that world really to starting to think a bit more about gallery-based artwork. So the previous work, I would say, was inspired by systems, thinking about the world as systems. The second one, this phase, was starting to create artworks that behave like systems, but I still hadn't really found what my idea was. So I would do gallery-based installations. That's with a collaboration with an artist, a writer called Mar Mundair. This was with a band or a music collective called Bathysphere in Leicester. I started to do a lot more work in Leicester in the early 2000s, where the multimedia set I created was synchronized with lights, and so that the music triggered the multimedia, which triggered the lights, and we had this nice sort of feedback loop going on. That's really good. And then my master's work at Camberwell, I was exploring these flowy ideas that were driven interactive artworks. And then a construction of artwork here at the bottom left, I guess, where it was like an empty system and people would come along and put their pictures on the website, and they'd leave barcodes that were generated by the website. And if you wanted to see them, you'd use this barcode scanner to retrieve their pictures. And I sort of imagined this as a system accepting material in, growing, people contributed to. And as you can see, quite a few people contributed. And I had this other one where it was a blank screen until people started looking at it, and then it would fill with faces, and then the faces would fade away and more people came along. And so I was thinking, okay, the artwork is a system. And the system, it starts in these cases, starts off as an empty vessel, and through interaction, it became full. And then if there's no interaction, it became empty. So starting to work with systems ideas. And then the final picture of this old cottage actually is Schumacher College down at Dartington. And I attended a number of courses there about systems view of life, which was something Fritjof Capra talked about. And I got to spend in total maybe 3 weeks with Fritjof Capra, working with him, understanding his ideas and more detail. So this was happening in the early 2000s. So I was getting there. I thought I can combine systems thinking with art. And then, well, okay, I've got enough of an idea to move to the next level. I started a PhD at Montfort University when I really did start to discover that systems thinking and systems artworks are by no means new. And as well as a systems art movement, I actually got to meet systems artists like Ernest. And I then discovered that my supervisor at university was a systems artist as well. We never talked about it. Stephen Scrivener, got to talk to him. And then I found that through what we called reflective practice, looking at my artwork, looking at literature, meeting people, I realized that systems thinking and artwork were not, well, maybe my approach was slightly different in some respects, but I certainly discovered there was a history. And I've always realized since then, we've got to share our history when it comes to digital arts, because everything has a history. You might think you've got the best original idea going. Somebody else thought of it. It doesn't undermine your approach. You can be inspired by them. So I was lucky enough to have Ernest take over as my main supervisor a few years in. And then through the work of Ernest Edmonds, Linda Candy and Stephen Scrivener again, I discovered reflective practice and I began to see myself as a reflective practitioner. And I completed my PhD, which was about systems art, or from connected digital art, which is the sort of I used to use for the non-systems founded idea of my work, to cybernetic ecologies, which is this idea that you can see humans and artworks working together, exchanging matter as part of an ecology. So I think I summarized the idea there. Digital artworks can be seen as systems and interact with each other as well as humans. And that was my cybernetic ecology. The word actually came from a poem by Richard Brautigan, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, quite probably his most famous poem. And that line, I dream one day of a cybernetic ecology where humans and machines live together in harmony and so on. I don't know if it's ironic or whatever, but it certainly seems to be the dream at the moment. Machines, AI, humans, the animals and whatever. So it was quite a good term to use. And I used it as a basis for my concept, but also an exhibition. And I would say that within reflective practice, where you go through cycles, and there can be different models, but I have the cycle of I theorize, I think about my work, I can't stop being a researcher, even though I'm an artist. I don't mean that I don't have intuition and I don't have flights of fancy and so on, but I do like to have a bit of structure to what I do. So I have theories and ideas. I create work, I exhibit work, data during both of those things. I write blog posts, take pictures and whatever. And then afterwards, I look at all the stuff I've got and I reflect and I think, now what have I learned? How might I develop my artwork further? I go through these loops, which forms a spiral. So I continue to do that. And these cycles, sometimes they can be very quick, sometimes they can be very slow. I think I'm coming out of quite a long one, maybe a sort of 4-year cycle. And I've got a feeling my next ones, as I prioritize creating my artwork more, will be faster. But it's not about how long they take. It's about going through a process to enable you as an artist or a thinker to build on your own creative work, try to develop it further. And in fact, other people in the room, I know are reflective practitioners. I think Stephen Bell.
I don't think you can avoid it, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's a name for something everyone does or should do.
Okay, it's very popular now. But it's, for me, the cycle, having my path, having a process is very, very important. So I produced an exhibition of work called Cybernetic Ecology, where it was the first opportunity to showcase what might seem a completely new direction in my creative practice. So I went from those big flowy images, often with just loads of images thrown in that sort of capture this sense of being in a chaotic, in a systems flowy sort of interaction with the world, to minimalizing it down, simplifying it down to the core elements I was interested in. How do systems work and interact? How do components form wholes and so on? And this exhibition took place in Leicester, which after about 2004, I got a small Arts Council grant and I started working with Bathysphere. I began to see Leicester as my creative home, having been based in Derby for my really early work and then Nottingham. Actually, it's the nearest city I live to, Leicester. So I don't know why I didn't start in Leicester, but anyway, you have to go on a journey sometimes. And so decent size exhibition, and it consisted of digital and printed versions of these I call systems artworks. So these works are constructed out of a set of colours. In fact, it starts with a random set of colours that are organised according to rules. And you have different layers organised according to different rules. So actually when they're running live, so the bottom centre image is a screen where the system is running live. You see them constructing themselves, never changing. This one also had prints as well. I'm quite happy to use print as a snapshot of a moment in time in my artworks. And then I thought, well, I would explore some different shapes because I quite like the interacting of the shapes. And I was fairly happy with this exhibition. So there were in total 9 digital pieces that constantly exchanged core elements with each other. They reorganized the parts to form their grids. And then there were another 18 prints. And I saw this as a system of 27 images, all connected by patterns of organization and processes of organization, some of which were snapshots and some of which were live. And this was actually the final part of the final cycle of my research. It was after doing this that I think I got the core element, the core idea of what my art was about, which was about this idea that interactive work can be thought of as systems, but also that artworks can interact with each other as well as humans. And in particular, at the end of this process, I got a little obsessed with this image, which is my favorite early image. So there is a group of colors here, 25 colors. There are a group of colors here. This image starts off by generating a total of 50 colors according to some parameters, but using random numbers. And then you get half the numbers, half the colors there, half the colors there. This has a rule which says sort whatever you've got by brightness, zigzag. And this one sorts whatever colors you've got by hue in a zigzag. When you're fully sorted, when you've done that process, swap a color so they and then they carry on sorting again. So when it's running live, these two images are swapping colors all the time and reorganizing themselves. And I just thought it worked. I got the idea. I felt that there was something within this image that was the core idea, but then a few things still niggled me about it. And it became one of those images. I thought, if I'm going to make new work, I have to sort out those niggles. I can't just keep banging these out and saying, look at these nice colors. And you'll see in a minute that a big part of my reflection was how to move this forward. So hopefully you understand the idea that these are two interacting images. This is a snapshot, a static print of the interaction, and through a process they've organized themselves. So this one looks a bit different to that one, not just because of the colors, but I think partly what I liked about this was just so happened that most of the lighter colors ended up here, and then the greens, blues ended up there. Just aesthetically, I liked it. I also like the fact it's got a reflection of the building across the road from the gallery in it, because it's all about these interactions. So that's wasn't intentional at the time, but I like this version of it. So that was quite a nice image, and I reflected on that for quite a while. Now, one of the big things that I realized I didn't like was I didn't like these random numbers that I was using all the time. So I chose 25 random or 50 random colors, and I organized them into squares, 5 by 5 squares of random colors. And then as they organize themselves, that wasn't random, but the process of swapping colors was random. And I thought, well, I've got a bit of a beam up on it about these random numbers. I don't like random numbers. And I sort of came to a conclusion that these systems are sorts of mini models of the world around us. And the world around us, I don't think is random in any sense. It's just very complex. Some things are hard to predict, not because they're random, because there are so many different factors that might influence something, that in order to understand what comes next, you need to understand a very complex world. And my systems were random, so they were not deterministic. And I think determinism is important. I think I want my artworks to have a sense of determinism, that if you know enough about the systems that are used to construct them, and if you knew all of their history, you could generate the same artwork. There are no big surprises. And I might share some views about random numbers with some of the people here. I also started to realize that random numbers are often used as a way of simulating complexity. Artists might be interested in complexity and emergence, these properties of systems that make the world interesting. And rather than work hard on making complex artworks, they use random numbers. It makes the artwork look more complex than perhaps it is. And I think as a systems thinker, complexity is far too important to just simulate. And I often draw a distinction here between complexity and complicated. And I recount, some of you may have heard it, a story that Pedro Capra passed on to me. It was passed on to him, and it may even, one of those stories that you never know if it really happened. But he said somebody was talking to a Concorde engineer, and he said, well, Concorde is really complicated. There are thousands and thousands of bits, and every bit has to do a certain job in a certain way. And out of all of those bits, a very complicated machine emerges. And if those bits don't do their job properly, the machine stops working. In fact, it did happen, of course, with Concorde. That's complicated. Complexity is different. Complexity doesn't require lots of bits. It can be based around a subtle interaction with a small number of parts. And so, being French, this Concorde engineer said that Concorde was complicated and mayonnaise is complex. Right? Only a few bits, but combined in such a way, you get beautiful mayonnaise. And if things don't come together to produce that beautiful mayonnaise, it can take horrible. I like that because it does explain that complexity can emerge out of simple parts being put together, and an interaction between those parts leads to something high, whereas human machines typically are very complicated, but don't really have true complexity. In fact, it's crucial they behave in a completely predictable way. If they don't, Concorde crashes, which did happen. And so I thought this was probably the element or the essence of why I felt that previous image using random numbers was not quite right. And I also, out of that image, started to develop the concept of what I call recoverability, which is if my artworks are the product of well-defined processes, well-defined parts, interacting with each other over periods of time, then in principle, you could look at that image, study it, and recover those systems. Embedded within the image should be the pattern of organization, and you should be able to get insights into the process. I'm not saying anyone would ever study them in detail, but in principle, they could sit there with a color meter and watch them happen over time. And then I sort of started to think, well, my job as an artist actually is to provide people with information to enable them to do that, even if they never will do it. I don't pretend anyone's going to study my artwork. So what I'm trying to do is I'm providing clues and insights into the underlying system. And the artwork is a representation of the system. I think Solowetz said something similar. So again, no new ideas. The artwork represents the system, and maybe the system is the artwork. And now that might be difficult for most people to understand, but I do try general viewer. So that's not the artwork, it's the idea that's the artwork, but it's conceptual art, I guess. That's the same sort of thing. And I call this concept, the idea that you could work it out if you really wanted to, recoverability. And I think Ernest tells me that term has been used before. Yet again, I haven't invented something. I think you were talking about the systems group having a similar concept. We can chat more about that. And also you can add to that actually when you make computer art, they're not real random numbers. They're only random numbers. They're pseudo-random. In a pseudo-random number sequence, not random, pseudo-random. It is actually a deterministic sequence. It's just that there appears complex, an even distribution of random numbers. And then for me, the thing that I got to was looking at this image. This issue of randomness was an unnecessary distraction, meaningless distraction. And that was my problem. Random numbers The fact they were random was really breaking my chain of thought, and my creative work had to get beyond obsessing about random numbers. So in 2019, I thought, okay, so maybe I have to have a single random event. Maybe like the universe, which notionally was a random event. One thing happened which generated all the material I want to use in my work. Can't go before that. I can't say what happened before, but I can control what happens after. So I generated this set, which is 4,096 colors, 64 by 64 in this representation, of numbers that follow the following rules. So every single color is different in terms of its hue, saturation, and lightness value. So no two hues, colors, lightness, brightness, and saturation, the amount of color. No two are the same on any colors. And I used a pseudo-random number generator that had a very good distribution across 4,096 colors. I would assume that I could assume they're fairly evenly distributed across that space. So there are 4,096 colors, no two of which share the same hue, saturation, and lightness. And I thought, right, from now on, if anybody says where do your colors come from, I just say they come from that palette, which I created on the 23rd of the 11th, 2019, which is the day I did it. That was the seed for the random number generator, so-called random number generator. It's also the day I had an appointment and I knew I was going to lose my sight in one eye. So it felt like a significant day. Maybe it wasn't that significant after all, actually, but it did feel significant. So it almost felt like the start of an epoch. And that was my starting point. And all of my work since has worked with those numbers. Now, that is a meaningless set of numbers. There's no reason for those numbers. It just came out of the random number generator. And as I have worked through it, I've realized there could be any number of random sets within this color space, not quite infinite. I said it would be infinite if I went deep enough. I could generate loads and loads of color spaces that would be equally distributed, but no two would be the same. It's like a sort of multiverse of possible shapes, possible colors. And then I started to spend time where I would explore this palette. And this was a work that was shown in Sydney as part of Ernest's associate exhibition for his retrospective exhibition in Sydney. And really, I'm looking at filtering those palettes. So I saw it as horizontal and vertical palettes at the time. So 64 horizontal palettes. Sorry, 64 horizontal palettes of 64 colors and 64 vertical palettes. And then I would make a subjective decision about which colors I wanted in the artwork and which ones I didn't. So I rejected very bright and very dark colors. Every one of these colors, I should say, is a color. Even some of them look black and white, just either a very saturated or very unsaturated or very bright or not very bright. So every one of these squares has a color. It's just sometimes you can't see the color because of the saturation and light. And so I would filter them down and construct these grids. This notionally would be a 64 by 64 grid of these. I've applied selection rules on colors, and then I represent the color, not just by color or the values, by the color value, but I orientate them according to their hue and lightness values. So they take on different parts of the canvas space according to their lightness and color values. So a simple one there being that hue, I literally interpret it as a rotation. So the angle of the line is according to the hue value, thinking of different ways of using that data, if you like. I was quite pleased with that. It's nicely presented. I also looked at other ways of presenting the work. So again, this is the same core work, but then these are different representations of the colors. And I got a whole bunch of old-fashioned video screens. And again, I had this little thing about how people obsess about new technology to the extent that they only ever look at the technology. I think one of the worst things someone can say to you as a digital artist is, that's a nice screen, or that's a fantastic headset. Yeah, maybe it is, but I don't want you to look at that. So I got these grubby old screens, and then people would say, oh, that's a lovely old screen, so you can't win. I also looked at different ways of presenting this work. So this one here is a set of colors. These are organized by hue, based on the palettes, filtering out colors that didn't fit my rule. And this was shown on an empty shop window just after lockdown as part of an AR artwork. So you could walk around with your phone and you'd point at, well, actually you'd point at the artwork, and then it would actually run the video and it'd tell you about the artwork and so on. That's quite fun. And then even locally, I like working in Leicester because I think there's something about place that matters. I don't think I'm provincial. I just like the idea of working in a place. And even for digital art, which you think, well, that's not about a place. It's not like Turner or Constable who are associated with a place. You know, digital art can be made anywhere, but I want to make it in the city that I'm working in. So, and then there are opportunities to show work in unconventional places. I often do that. So this is Cultural Quarter in Leicester, and I've got about 4 lampposts with my own work on. I call them my lampposts. Some of them are looking a bit grotty now. They've probably been visited by 4-legged friends and whatever. So I sort of quite like putting art in places, not just expecting people to come and have a look at it. And then a couple of years ago, I felt, well, I've done enough playing. It's some more reflection time again. I created some works, and I felt the ideas were developing, but I needed to really think about what it is I was trying to do. That's where this new piece of work comes from. And I'm now going to present it, and afterwards we can have a chat. I'm hopefully not going to run too much longer, maybe another 20 minutes maximum, about an hour or so. So I developed with the 2311-2019 grid, a well-defined set of colours. So now I don't have to send colours to artworks. I can just give them the palette and say, use this, but in particular, use colours that meet this criteria, or I can simply say, use colour 1-1 and refer to it. So if I'm interested in things being connected, I'm very much like the idea that I just share the palette, and artwork just needs to be sent numbers, and those numbers represent a colour palette entry. So I've got a well-defined set of colours. So if I work on rules for how these colours should be organised and processes for achieving levels of organisation, carry on doing that. I think my systems need to be connected. So within systems thinking, there's this concept of open and closed. The closed system is one that doesn't allow anything new in, even allow energy in. And so it just operates with a fixed set of material, and maybe it has some internal rules about how that material gets organised. An open system is one that doesn't allow the exchange of material between multiple systems. And I wanted to create artworks that were connected, so they had a sense of being open. So I wanted to connect the systems together so they swap stuff. I wanted to look at structures or forms that go beyond grids. If you're into grids, it's very hard to break out of the grid, quite literally. And I wanted to explore non-visual structures. Again, the reason I mentioned my eyesight thing is because now I'm starting to realise the importance of using different senses in the work. I wanted to have some infrastructure that I could make inherently distributed. So my artworks can be in multiple locations or separated over time. I imagined a situation where I'd have thousands of distributed artworks constantly communicating with each other. Which is where I want to get to. So I took, this slow, I think I pressed the next button. Oh, okay, yeah. It's quite a big image, I suppose. So I started by looking at the top left of my 2311-2019 image. And this is 8 pixels by 32 pixels. And again, these are, let's say, random. Well, they are random, random colours. And I saw each one of these lines forming the basis for a system. So we've got all of these systems, 8 of them, 32 colours, but they're completely disorganised. There are no rules that organise the parts here. I wanted to carry on using some of the rules that I've used before, and I found 2 rules that I quite like, which is one rule is sort the colours by hue. Another rule is sort the colours by brightness. So you could imagine what would happen if you applied the rule. The process I use is basically a bubble sort, so you can see it doing its thing. And when you apply, I think, alternate hue, lightness rules to these, they begin sorting, and I'll show it live in a minute. And then if I take these systems and rather display them as lines, I look at other forms, we end up with something like this, which has become the signature image for this exhibition. So this is recoverable. You can look at this, and if you know the rules, you can deconstruct it. You might ask, well, why is it circles? And I'm an artist, so I'm allowed to do whatever I want. I decide that I like circles. I'm not pretending that side of it is anything more than a simple personal aesthetic choice. Although I like circles in terms of their shape, things organise themselves in circles in nature quite a lot anyway, bubbles and that and the other things in trees. It's a common thing. We all recognise circles. So if I look at this, starting from here, I would appear to have blues going all the way around and then turning into greens there. And on this one, let's see, you can see it here. These are lightness. So these are light colours going around until you get to dark colours at the top here. So two simple sorting rules. Now you can see that if you alternate through these going towards the centre, that those rules are applied: lightness, colour, lightness, colour, lightness, colour. And again, circles, I chose it because I like circles. I did try introducing different shapes into my elements. What I don't like actually is additional shapes in, because many people will say, well, why have you got circles there and squares there? That doesn't matter. So I'm not going to complicate things by saying circles, squares and elements, and I'll stick with squares. When you get into rule-based art, sometimes you can obsess a little bit about your rules. I'm very keen on this recoverability idea, so things don't get in the way. So actually, as a still image, if you know the sorts of things I do, and certainly you've had a colour meter, you could work out what's being done here. So I think that's quite a successful image. But of course, they're not just static images. That would be a little bit boring. Not necessarily, but trying to do. It's not going to have to drag this onto the other screen. Let's try it. It is. Okay, so I'm going to put this on here. I can't get the other one to go on screen. Let's try it again. And then I'm going to show it running live, and then I'll just talk you through a little bit about how. There we go. It's constructed. Green. Yeah, now, so I'm going to reset this system so that it goes back to its unsorted state. And the first thing it does is it sorts itself. So these systems are now sorting themselves according to my simple rules. And at some point, before too long, they will reach a sort of homeostasis, a point at which they've satisfied the rule. Now, if I didn't do anything beyond that, it would be a still of sorted colours. But because the systems are connected to each other, as soon as they reach that state, another rule says swap the beginning of one with the end of the other. So they're swapping colours. And now the system has to incorporate that colour into its structure. So it will sort again. And so it maintains a constant state of reorganization. It's never completely static. They're always moving. And there's something that emerges from this, which I thought would, but it did it in a surprising way, which is the lightness systems. Very light and very dark colours are at the ends. And they're the ones that are likely to get swapped more often. For the colour sorting system, it starts at red, goes through green, blue, and back to red. So the reds are at the end. So the colours that no system wants are light or dark reds. So when it's reached its sorted steady state, what you'll see is now travelling around are these bad penny colours. No system wants them. So it's trying to get rid of them. It sorts itself and said, this is at the end, I want to get rid of this. And the other one says, oh, right, I grabbed that. Oh, I don't like it either. So it sorts it and gets rid of it. And so these bad penny colours pass through the systems. It's always in a state of reorganisation. So I quite liked working with circles. another natural form of spirals. So it's the same underlying system, same process, now organized as a spiral. So the ends, we go around, the end of one system becomes the beginning of the next, and then becomes the end, and they sort themselves and then pass the color on. Again, I think that is recoverable. I think you can get that out of the image, but I think I want to add a few more clues. So I might actually allow you to click on a color, and then you can watch it being passed around the system. So you get a sense of this constant reorganization. And then I couldn't resist visualizing it in the same way as I often do, as lines or colors. This makes it a bit clearer. That's clearly a hue sorting, and that's a lightness sorting, and then back to a hue. And horizontal and vertical. As it grids here, this is the grid folded back on itself, so colours actually zigzag down throughout the system. And then thinking, well, actually, I know at some point I'm getting quite into breaking out of grids. I'm going to explore more dynamic forms. So the classic infinity sign, the lemniscate. I thought I'd create one of those. And then there was a slightly second thing I hadn't anticipated, was that because this is almost like two circles stuck next to each other, this system here, the blues are over here and the greens are over here, top and bottom end of the system. The light ones are over here on this side and the dark ones are over there. So I'm starting to get the sort of thing I want to see, which is I get some surprises in the structure of the image. And then similar sort of thing here. I've often had these little star forms, and you can see a division here. So I think it's all working quite nicely. So I felt that I've reached a point where this is worth sharing. I'm fairly happy with these as a piece of artwork. So it might let me simply click and go back to my slides. Now, I like prints, and I thought I would capture a single moment and explore more combinations of my prints. So Computational Constructs, which is out here, is 20 prints, but there are actually 26 in the series. But I'm not too worried about that. It's a moment. All of the prints are the same moment. There are 8 structural systems. So you saw them, squares and spirals, circles, vertical, and so on. Each one of those contains 8 systems. There's things that are spinning around, organizing themselves, and each system contains 32 elements. Just like in all natural systems or human-made systems, there are multiple elements. You can look at the same system in different ways and get different insights from it. That's important. And for the printed work, I also vary the background color. I'll show you an image and explain why. And then I added onto that, as well as the individual 16 combinations of squares, so 4s and 9s, and finally the 5, or rather 2s and 3s, and 4 images, and the 4s. And then in the exhibition, I also show the source as well. So this really is, well, now I have another question. What is the artwork again? Is that the artwork, or is that just a view into the system, which is the artwork? I haven't settled on that, but what I have decided to do is not to name individual pieces within any collection. So all of these are computational constructs. That's not 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. They're just, that is it. So this is a window into my system, the different structures, different systems and so on. And in this case, something I've done over the last few years is I color the backgrounds differently because I like the way foreground and background swaps depending on the color. So that is the same shape, form, different backgrounds, different things become foreground and background. And there's a relationship between the parts as well. So I like to think at every level there's intent. If you really want to sit down and notice that, for example, squares form a sideways square, and these two are swapped, but they're also swapped there. You can make of it what you wish. What I would say is it's all intentional. There might be some unintentional patterns, but I stared at these for so much time. I could probably rationalize them. And then we could look at some individual parts. These are the prints. Again, it's all the same moment. So I'm going to look at this spiral, three colours. Let's call it black, black, purple, but of course they are colours, just that they're very dark colours. And if you go here, you can see it starts here on this one, black, black, purple, and so on. So it's the same moment. It's just that the forms are different. And again, lemniscapes. And then I group them in groups of 4. Idea being that maybe this imaginary obsessive would look at these and they could decode, they could realise that all of them, I'm giving you a heads up, but they would realise that it's all the same system. And then there are other ones. And then there are 3s, and then we're back to 4s. So computational constructs is the prints. It's also a set of videos that I'm adding to. But it's also a computer program that runs on my server. And maybe that is the art. Maybe that's the artwork. That's the thing that if somebody wanted to say, I would like to buy this art, what can you give me? I'll say, well, here's the code and here's the server. That's the art. Generate your own images. You can have as many images as you like. That is the system is the artwork. But of course, and it's again, this is very slow at generating. I think it is moving to the next slide. Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah. Actually, it's not just colours. This is actually what I use. So every copy of this artwork running anywhere has this data file, which is my 4096 colours. It has on that 64 by 64 grid index and X and Y position, and then the values, hue, saturation, and lightness. They're all going down to 5 digits. So in 5 digits, I need to work out theoretical maximum number of systems or universes that could accommodate the colour space, but it must be thousands and thousands. They're moderately spread out and generated according to this ELIA algorithm. So what if I looked at that data and you did different things with it? And the obvious thing of interest was to look at it as sound. So let's see if I can now to that. Okay. Can you see? No. I have to, okay, so I'd have to drag it onto that screen, but is it being broadcast? I don't know. Okay. In a second, I will hopefully. Right. So that is it running. Go here. Listen to it. Oh, so there it is running on my web page. So if you do go to the web page, that is the actual live system. It's not just a video. However, we found that I have to use this to play sound through the system. So image, the data is used each system tape, going from the really low ones, in this case, the low ones to the high ones. And they generate sound. Now, what I realised with sound is that you can sort of zone in, listen to different bits of it. It's very deeply textured. This has got sometimes just listen to the hue or just listen to brightness systems. And the brightness systems are, because I'm turning the hue go up and down and create little melodies. And the brightness ones, the hue one, these up and down drones. So again, this is experimental. I haven't really developed this very much. What I've realised is that you can listen to them and gain insight into how they're structured. So you can look at them and gain insight when you listen to them. So systems producing music towards the end of January. In terms of music, I have spent quite a long time listening to this. I don't necessarily want to release it on the internet, call it music. I think already with this just his first pass, it's starting to sound quite musical and harmonious. It will occasionally go quiet and things like that. Quite good fun. So let's close that. and go back to the presentation. We'll find out how to get the cursor back on here. Still on there. I'm sure exactly which side it's connected.
Down instead of across.
Okay, well,
Off the screen now.
yeah, it's off screen. Maybe it is. Oh, it's back on this one. So let's have a little up. Appear to be lots of different ones. All right. So where am I with this work? Well, I feel fairly happy with the audio and visual elements of it. So I'm calling this Computational Construct 1. I've still got loads of other bits of palette to explore. So it's like a territory that I can go and look at. And I sort of feel when I'm doing it, I realized that when I first got them playing music, I sort of felt the music was always there. And I somehow discovered it by just giving them a voice. It really did feel as if I wasn't creating, I was discovering. And that is actually a common thing throughout my practice. I often feel that I'm discovering things in the system rather than creating a system. So I will probably carry on exploring that a little bit more. I will also be very much exploring the sound side of things. Now, you wouldn't have heard it here, but at the moment, the sound is spread across stereo space. It does sound rather impressive in headphones. And I maybe physically see a room full of artworks making sound. And as you move around, they come in and out of focus. And there are other principles, different forms, and this, that, and the other that I'm exploring. But I also feel I've got something here which to me feels worthy of a name, as other people could use it. And at this moment in time, I'm calling it reconstructivism. So the idea of what is a reconstructivist artwork. Now, the term reconstructivism, like all these terms, somebody's invented it and used it for something else, but nothing to stop me reinventing it. So it's a work in progress, but I'm going to submit a paper to Eva where I think I'll have something worth sharing. I've only got a week or so. It's worth mentioning Eva coming up soon, or the deadline coming up soon, at conference in July. So a reconstructivist artwork, what is it? Well, it's a digital art system. So digital artwork conceptualized as a system of interacting parts. And maybe some of those parts might be humans and some might be machines, and there are elements that get passed around, this, that, and the other. So parts that form coherent wholes. The parts are organized according to a pattern. So there's a reason the parts are put into that order. Like us as human beings, we're not just a random blob of elements. We are organized, most of us anyway. But we're organized according to rules. And those rules lead to huge complexity and complicatedness as well, I'd say. So they have a pattern and they have a process. So an artwork of this sort of genre has a pattern it's trying to achieve and a process to achieve it. And when it reaches that level of organization, something might disrupt it at some point, not immediately, but at some point, a new color or a new thing may happen. New sound may come in. They exchange elements with other artworks or humans. They can be triggered into processes of organization by other artworks or humans. A static artwork may get disrupted and then have to work to reorganize itself before it reaches a state of homeostasis. And I would say that they form ecologies of connected systems that could be separated by time or they could be separated by distance. So these are some initial principles of artworks that operate according to this idea. What happens if other people make artworks like this? Well, we can connect our artworks. Again, I mentioned Ernest, but we did some experiments in interconnected artworks. I would love to get more reconstructivists involved in artworks that exchange stuff. Now, the important thing is you need to be thinking about what it means to exchange stuff with another artwork, because if you don't do it with a set of rules or a pattern, your artwork disintegrates. It's no longer your artwork. People could give me a whole brand new set of colours and it would look completely different, but it would still be my artwork because the rules are intact and the patterns are intact. So just to finish up, as part of this exhibition phase of this part of my work, obviously we had the exhibition here, and I'm showing the same work in Leicester. Computala is an event in Leicester which I would encourage you to submit to. So like an open call search for Computala Leicester or Digital or Computer Art Club who are organising it, Sean Carroll, some of you may know. I'm going to put in the next live version, which will be at least 9, possibly all 16 interacting live systems. So that means there are 16 times 8, so there are 256 subsystems, all swapping stuff, all organising themselves, and all generating sound. That should be quite fun. And then I'm going to perform the music. I'm going to disrupt the systems in a meaningful way to get them to make music that sounds more harmonious to my ears. And I'm calling this Music for Humans and Robots because I was trying to imagine what sort of music would robots like. And I think they'd like music that had deep patterns that they could get into. One's patterns that maybe are a bit inaccessible for us, but also want it to sound interesting to us. So that's what its working title is. That is most definitely an experiment. I'll be talking at Phoenix in Leicester in February, where I'll reflect on its previous work. And then I'm pondering about the idea of selling the work. How do you sell a systems artwork? You sell the whole system or you sell bits of a system? I've got some idea. It won't be expensive. I just like to engage with that idea. What does it mean to transfer ownership of a systems artwork to someone else without giving the entire system away? And then for my work in China, later in the year, we're lining up an exhibition of the work in Guangzhou. So I have a nice collection of activities. And then I think that's the final slide. So that will take you to my website where I'm documenting all the work and Interact Digital Arts, and I'm Sean Cuttlefish on Instagram and a few other sites, and that's my email address as well. So if you're interested in the process, or you just want to have a closer look at it, or you want to become a reconstructivist, drop me a line, and hopefully you will be witness to the next iteration, Computational Constructs 2, which I'm already thinking about. Might happen in September or something like that. I think it's going to take that long to get there. And as I go through my big palette, I'll be developing new, more sophisticated ways of doing things. And that's it. Now,
So thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for your insights into your system and how you can reconstruct from that and sort of work backwards from the artwork. Do we have any questions for Sean, please? Sarah.
Do you, so you're using very obviously kind of not speculative systems, but random systems. Do you apply any systems from the real world, or do you try and kind of like quantify or use them within your art? Right.
well, it depends what you mean by the real world. The piece of work I'm going to show in January will use a special camera called an AI camera that can interpret a bit more about its environment than simply give you an image. And it can look at gestures, this, that, and the other. And I'm interested in using that to trigger the reorganization process. So it's reorganized, it's triggered, the systems are reorganized by a trigger. And that trigger would be a human moving or something else happening in space, number of faces, that sort of thing. But again, principle of recovery is that I would like you to be able to work out what's going on. So you might approach the artwork and see it responding to you or multiple people. And if you really wanted to, you could spend a bit of time studying it and you could work out what's going on. What I don't want is something that is just completely unrecoverable. You can't work out what's going on because it's like very esoteric. It's grabbing data from the stock market or something like that. I want it to be in the experience of the artwork.
Thanks, Sean. That was a great talk and really, really interesting and inspiring. Just a couple of things to do with the early part of your talk, really. You mentioned the recoverability, which came to me from the systems artists who had that very strong view. And in a sense, meant that randomness didn't work for them. But I was thinking about, this is just a funny comment, really, I'm afraid, not a real question. But I was thinking about the randomness, pseudo-random thing, and about the fact that Tom Stoppard died just recently, and we think about him. And if you think about Rosamund Clark and Gilstone are dead, it begins with a joke about randomness.
Oh, I hadn't picked up on that. Yeah, okay.
Where the two actors flip a coin. Or I can't remember exactly, but maybe something like 100 times, where it always comes up heads. And they always say, well, you know, the next time it's bound to come up tails because it's come up heads so often. And that is, of course, a joke about real randomness.
Yeah.
Which pseudo-random systems don't allow. And that's the big difference.
Yeah. Well, that if
And I just wonder whether you have any thought about that in terms of how you've used it in your own work.
Well, when I have one of these ponderous moments, I do see my color palette as like a little mini universe. And I could generate a huge number of universes, but some would be very boring because if it was real randomness, it might only contain dark colors or light colors, or it might only contain reds and this, that, and the other, because they're all possible. Like you say, all of these things are possible. That 4096 color grid could all be red. It's very unlikely, but it could be red. It's just as possible as any other combination. So part of my job is to identify the interesting sets from the boring sets from my perspective, but it's just my perspective. So yes, I could generate huge numbers of starting grids, but I, as an artist, would make a decision about the one I want to use. And that's where it comes in. That's where the human has to make a decision. One making that decision, well, it's an aesthetic decision, it's a personal decision. You know, we all have favorite colors. There's a certain green I don't like because it always makes me think of a sweet I had as a kid, which I hated. And if I see that green popping, oh, I don't like that. That was completely irrational. It's not sense, but that's me as an artist. I bring all of that into my decision making. So I agree. I think you have to be human when it comes to making sense, and you have to say this is not rational because I'm a human being. I'm going to choose that one, that set of colours, and that's my favourite one because, and it's just because I like it. Does that sort of answer it? Or?
There's one behind as well.
Oh, sorry, I think it was first. I'll go for you first, then Tim. Yeah. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Malcolm Hughes told me, which I may have mentioned at one of these meetings before when I said, how do you because effectively you're generating an end space, a space of multiple potential. And a lot of systems do that. And I can remember talking to Malcolm when I was at the Slade saying, how do you deal with this? And he said, well, you choose examples which are sort of archetypal, and you sort of have to explore it and see which of what do you discover that sums up what's special about the system, what are its characteristics.
Yeah.
But that comes around to the thing I was wondering about, your concern about where the artwork is. Apart from I remember Harold Cohen says, who gives a fuck, it's interesting. He actually used that word, which is but I think of it myself as a bit like music, in the sense that the algorithm is a bit like music. And I'm just wondering whether you've thought of it that way, in the sense that you can when you're talking about sharing a system, it's like a composer writes a manuscript that can then be interpreted in lots of different ways. So there's a kind of, I don't know whether you thought about it in that way at all.
I thought about the analogy of music and how also improvisation, how the various jazz band, improvised jazz band, the various systems, musicians feedback on each other to create something that has structure, but it's probably different every time. And then also the idea of the artwork being a score and the system running is a performance.
Because it's a bit like that with VJing, I guess.
Yeah.
There's that interrelationship between performers and
feedback and connections, and you making decisions about what you think fits with this and on the spot.
Yeah, so you've got some precedents in your experience that might inform a solution.
So you talk about it being kind of a homeostatic type system, and we can see these different parts of it kind of organizing themselves, all the blues on the right, whatever you said, the lights on the left. Have you run this at super fast speed? You could, you're running it very slowly. You can just look way into the future, and does it, once it gets to this state, it doesn't get stuck anywhere, or does it get
Well, the weird thing is I've had it running for days and days and it's never got stuck. What does happen every now and then, I didn't mention this, but I can, is that the ends, if you get a certain combination of colours, you get a very light or very dark red and a very dark red. And they're effectively, they fit in the same place in both systems. It jiggles them. And I don't sonify that, but I think the jiggles are quite nice. I'd like to have a different sound when they jiggle. But it doesn't get stuck. I thought, oh, well, what will happen? It'll be like at the game of life where you get those across. It's never completely stopped because the other one is very unlikely. The other end is very unlikely to be jiggling at the same time. And as long as there's one that's being swapped and moving around, they continue to run. But
does it get into a kind of a repeating pattern once it's really sorted through? Only the little end bits can change.
Yeah, well, in this setup, it is just the end bits. It's hard for me to tell if there's a repeating pattern. There are only a finite number of bits moving around, so maybe there is, but it doesn't take very many bits to end up with something complex. I guess I could somehow monitor the system and find out if it's repeating. But what I would like to do next is consider different rules for exchanging. The good thing about the random exchange was it picked a colour from anywhere within the other system and swapped it. So it really stirred things up. It was like sort of really mixing up the systems. I need something that does that, but is a more deterministic thing. But I thought that's the reason I left them running for so long, that they would reach a stable state. But I haven't seen it happen yet.
Any more questions, please? Just go for it.
I'm interested in your use of systems, Sean. Because what lots of people don't realise is that Harrison Birtwistle was a systems composer, and quite a long time ago, quite early in his career, he got a friend of his who worked at IBM to print him out a set of random integers, and all his pieces from then on used those same integers for all those different pieces. And his explanation for what he was doing when he created the systems that generated his scores was he was trying to take the personality out of the music. So that actually it had to be that way because that was the system he designed. And it was all the stuff you're saying about choices. He didn't want any of that, but I didn't realize you'd done this sort of, random grid of colors. And I just thought that's very interesting that, he also had, way behind any one artwork, he had this list of random integers that informed everything.
Another way of explaining my approach to that grid of colors is that bits don't really matter. It's the wholes that matter. And just like a living system that's in a constant state of exchange with its environment, what passes through the system is not as important as the pattern of the system. So they say about human bodies regenerate every 7 years. Doesn't mean that we fundamentally are different, not certainly for that reason. It's just that flow through us of matter doesn't disrupt the pattern. The pattern gets disrupted, living things, it's not unable to function, they die. For my systems, I want them to have rules that are constantly reorganizing and the overall pattern remains the same. So despite after days and days of running, blues are on, it's one of the forms, blues are on that side, greens are on that side. That is a constant, and that effectively is the thing. Now, they're all different greens and different blues, but that is the overall structure.
Any more questions?
I just wonder, could you imagine having a disruptor that is like parasitic to it?
Yeah, I suppose then I'm thinking maybe some of your work where you're looking at systems.
Because then, I mean, you've got the predictability potentially of the system that people can work out, but then something added to it that may feed off it or respond to it in some way.
I could certainly see that as an interesting thing to experiment with. What I'm interested in actually for the next set of works, which is why I say I think the idea is already emerging, is that the forms, structures, influence are done alternate according to the bits that are in there. So they do change shape, they move a bit. they still maintain an overall pattern, but the individual patterns move around and their proximity to other systems affects each other. So that way the systems would be coherent, but then they'd be seen to change. And I'm not getting into E-life, although maybe some people might think of it. They're not meant to be pretend cells, but it's that relationship between form and the process inside the form that I'd like to explore a bit. Okay, well, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sean.